Single dads don't get to make demands up here, sir, especially not ones dressed like you." The words cut across the boarding cabin so sharply that even the overhead bins seemed to pause. A few passengers glanced up from their phones. Others looked away too quickly. The senior flight attendant stood in the aisle with one hand on a first-class curtain, her smile polished and cold. The man beside row 12 had only asked whether his little girl could stay close to him if the seat map had changed. Yet the woman in uniform said it loudly enough for half the plane to hear. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. What looked like a tired father being put in his place was something else entirely. Beneath the worn jacket, the scuffed duffel, and the careful silence was a man measuring every sound in the cabin, every vibration under his feet, every flicker of impatience in the crew. The insult landed, but it didn't move him. Before this flight was over, the same voice mocking him would tremble when she learned exactly who she had tried to shame. Marcus Hale didn't answer right away. He adjusted the backpack hanging from his daughter Lila's shoulder, then crouched so he could smooth the ribbon that had worked loose from her braid. He moved with a steadiness that seemed strange under pressure. When he finally rose, his face stayed calm, almost gentle, though something older and harder settled behind his eyes. "It's fine," he said, not to the flight attendant at first, but to Lila. "We're all right." The child looked up at him with the solemn seriousness children sometimes have when they've learned too early that adults can break in public. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her sneakers were clean but worn at the toes, and her little fingers were wrapped around a stuffed cloth rabbit gone gray with washing. She nodded because he needed her to. Then Marcus turned to the woman blocking the aisle. "I wasn't making demands," he said quietly. "I was asking where my daughter is supposed to sit if the gate changed our seats." Elena Cruz glanced at the boarding pass in his hand without taking it. Senior crew authority rested on her like a tailored coat, crisp scarf, immaculate hair, voice trained to make orders sound like policy. Around her, first-class passengers were still arranging carry-ons and winter coats, signaling wealth with leather luggage and expensive impatience. Marcus stood in that bright aisle like a stain no one wanted named. His jacket had weathered seams. His boots were old. A cheap plastic dinosaur peeked from his duffel's side pocket. "Then wait until I'm free," she said. "You're holding up boarding." He stepped aside at once, because Lila was watching. That mattered more than pride, more than the heat spreading across his neck, more than the businessman in 3C smirking as if the whole scene were low entertainment before takeoff. Marcus had spent the past 2 years learning how often the world mistook exhaustion for weakness. Since his wife died, every trip with Lila felt like carrying glass through a crowd. You kept your grip. You kept moving. You did not let strangers see the strain if you could help it. Still, strain was there. He felt it in the ache under his shoulders from too little sleep, in the dry burn behind his eyes, in the way Lila leaned against his leg whenever voices sharpened around her. They were flying to Lisbon because his late wife's mother had suffered a stroke, and there had been no one else to go. No one else to bring the granddaughter she'd been begging to see. Marcus had drained what little savings remained for the tickets. Economy, last minute, 2 seats together, until the gate agent frowned at her screen and told him the airline system might have rebalanced things. He had known better than to panic then. He knew better than to panic now. As the boarding line crawled forward, Elena continued greeting premium passengers with a warmth she had not offered him once. Marcus guided Lila toward row 27 when another attendant farther back checked their passes and frowned. Separate seats, one at the window, one across the aisle, and 3 rows behind. Lila's mouth parted, frightened but trying not to be. Before she could speak, Marcus had already scanned the cabin, the crew positions, the flow of passengers, the timing of service interruptions. He noticed everything in one sweep, instinctively. He lifted a hand for assistance again. From the front, Alina saw him and her expression tightened. Then she started down the aisle toward them, heels precise against the carpet, authority gathering around her like storm static. Alina Cruz stopped beside their row and crossed her arms lightly, the way people do when they want to look patient while clearly not being patient at all. "Sir," she said, lowering her voice just enough to sound polite while still carrying through the aisle, "boarding isn't the time to negotiate seating arrangements." Marcus looked down at the 2 boarding passes in his hand, one seat 27A, the other 30C. He felt Lila's small fingers curl tighter around his sleeve. "I'm not negotiating," he said quietly. "My daughter is 8. The system split our seats." Behind them, a man in a tailored navy suit sighed loudly. A woman 2 rows ahead twisted around to watch. Airplane cabins had a way of turning strangers into an audience the moment tension appeared. Alina barely glanced at the passes. "If the airline assigned separate seats," she said, "then that's the arrangement for this flight." Leela shifted closer to her father. "Daddy." Marcus crouched again so his eyes met hers. "It's okay," he murmured. "We'll fix it." He said it gently, but inside his mind was already mapping possibilities: crew authority, cabin layout, passenger swaps, emergency seating rules. Old instincts. Instincts he had spent years trying to quiet. But habits formed in the air never fully leave. Alina tapped the armrest beside them. "Sir, please take your assigned seat so we can finish boarding." Across the aisle, a middle-aged woman leaned forward. "She can sit with me," she offered softly. "My husband and I can move." Marcus gave her a grateful nod. But Alina stepped in before the exchange could settle. "Seat changes during boarding create delays," she said crisply. "Please follow the assigned chart." The cabin fell into that uncomfortable hush that forms when someone enforces rules without kindness. Marcus inhaled slowly. For a moment, irritation pressed against his ribs. Not anger, he had learned to file anger away, but a controlled pressure, the kind that comes when someone mistakes calm for surrender. Still, he kept his voice steady. "My daughter doesn't fly well alone." Alina's eyebrows lifted slightly. Then perhaps the ticket purchase should have been handled differently. The comment was subtle, but the implication wasn't. The businessman behind them chuckled under his breath. Marcus felt Lila shrink closer to him. That was the moment he realized the situation wasn't just inconvenience anymore. It had become a lesson playing out in front of his child about how people decide your worth before they know anything about you. He stood slowly. The movement was controlled, measured, the kind that suggested someone used to small spaces and careful balance. "I'm asking for help," he said. Elena sighed. "Sir, everyone on this aircraft has somewhere to be. You're not the only one with a story." The words landed harder than she intended. For a second something flashed behind Marcus's eyes, something older than exhaustion. Then it was gone. He nodded once. Understood. Without another word, he handed Leela the cloth rabbit and guided her into the window seat assigned to him. Then he stepped back into the aisle. "Stay here a moment," he told her gently. He moved 3 rows down to seat 30C. A teenage boy already sat there, headphones on, oblivious to the drama. Marcus studied the cabin again. He noticed the faint whine beneath the environmental system, a subtle vibration running through the floor panels. He noticed the exact moment the engine pitch outside shifted as ground crews finished pushback procedures. He noticed everything. Most people didn't hear those details. Most people weren't trained to. Marcus sat. The aircraft door closed with a solid hydraulic thump. Cabin lights dimmed slightly as systems transitioned to departure mode. Passengers settled. Overhead bins snapped shut one by one. A few rows ahead, Alina finished her final checks, clearly satisfied that order had been restored. For a moment, the tension dissolved into the familiar pre-flight routine. Leela twisted around in her seat trying to see her father. Marcus raised 2 fingers in a quiet signal. "I'm here." She relaxed. The plane began pushing back from the gate. As the engine spooled higher, Marcus leaned his head lightly against the seatback and closed his eyes, not to rest, to listen. He felt the vibration change as the aircraft aligned with the taxi lane. He counted the seconds between throttle adjustments. He noted the rhythm of the hydraulic pumps cycling beneath the floor. Old habits, old knowledge. A flight attendant walking past noticed him doing it and frowned slightly, confused by the strange stillness. But she kept moving. From the front of the cabin, Elena Cruz made a brief announcement welcoming passengers aboard the international flight to Lisbon. Her voice was confident again, professional, everything under control. Except Marcus had already heard something the rest of the cabin hadn't. Something subtle, something small, something that shouldn't have been there. He opened his eyes. His gaze moved slowly toward the wing outside Leela's window. A faint shudder traveled through the aircraft frame as the engines throttled up again. Most passengers felt nothing unusual. But Marcus did, because he had spent 15 years of his life learning how to recognize when a machine the size of a building was whispering that something wasn't quite right. He exhaled quietly. Then he glanced toward the front of the aircraft, toward the galley, toward Elena Cruz, and for the first time since boarding, Marcus Hale looked concerned. "Hey," he called gently down the aisle toward Leela. She leaned out of her seat. "Yeah, keep your seatbelt tight once they turn the sign on." Her brow wrinkled. "Why?" Marcus paused. Because he wasn't certain yet. But the sound under the floor had shifted again, and that tiny change in vibration was the kind of thing that only mattered to people who knew exactly how bad it could become. Leela tilted her head, still half-twisted in her seat, the cloth rabbit dangling from her fingers. "But the sign isn't on yet," she said. Marcus gave her a small reassuring smile. "It will be soon." She studied his face for another moment, trying to read something she couldn't quite understand. Then she nodded and turned back around, pulling the belt tighter across her lap, just like he had shown her on every flight they had ever taken together. Across the aisle, the middle-aged woman, who had offered to switch seats earlier, watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. "You fly a lot?" she asked Marcus softly. He shrugged a little. "Used to." The engines outside grew louder as the aircraft rolled toward the runway. The vibration through the cabin floor strengthened, the familiar low thunder of thousands of pounds of thrust building beneath the wings. Most passengers went back to their phones or closed their eyes. Marcus didn't. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, listening again. There. A faint oscillation threaded through the engine pitch. Not loud. Not obvious. But wrong. A pattern inside the vibration that didn't match the expected rhythm of balanced thrust. His jaw tightened just a fraction. Up front, Elena Cruz stood beside the forward galley jump seat, reviewing her tablet as the plane paused at the runway threshold. From where she stood, the cabin looked orderly again. Seatbelts fastened. Luggage stowed. Passengers quiet. The earlier confrontation already felt like a minor inconvenience in an otherwise routine shift. Then, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be departing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and your tray tables are stowed." The seatbelt sign chimed. Marcus noticed it immediately. He raised his hand slightly toward Lila again. She nodded back. Across the aisle, the curious woman smiled. "You called that early," she said. Marcus didn't answer. The aircraft began rolling onto the runway. Engines roared. Acceleration pressed passengers gently into their seats as the massive aircraft surged forward. Marcus's eyes closed again, listening, feeling, counting. 3 seconds. 5, 8, something shifted. The vibration intensified suddenly, then faded again. His eyes snapped open. That wasn't turbulence. That was asymmetrical thrust fluctuation. It happened again. Quick, barely noticeable, but real. Marcus sat up straighter. His mind moved automatically through possibilities. Fuel imbalance. Sensor misread. Compressor instability. He looked toward the wing again through the row ahead of him. The engine nacelle shimmered in the morning light as heat rippled behind it. The aircraft kept accelerating. Passengers around him seemed calm. Phones still out. Music playing through headphones. No one else had noticed. Across the aisle, the woman leaned closer again. "You okay?" she asked. Marcus nodded slowly. Just listening. Listening to what? He hesitated. Then said quietly, "The engines." The woman blinked. Before she could respond, the aircraft lifted off the runway. The familiar moment of weightlessness passed through the cabin as the landing gear folded upward. Helena exhaled slowly, the patience in her expression thinning. "Ma'am, aircraft experience minor turbulence all the..." The vibration pulsed again, stronger this time. The galley coffee pot rattled against its holder. A tray slid slightly inside a storage slot. Marcus watched Helena's eyes shift again just briefly. Now she couldn't pretend she hadn't felt it. Still, she held her ground. "Please sit down," she said more firmly. Marcus glanced toward the cabin windows. They had climbed above the clouds now. Sunlight washed across the wing outside, illuminating the large engine hanging beneath it. From here he couldn't see inside the nacelle. But he didn't need to. He could hear it. The rhythm of the turbine had a hitch in it. Tiny, irregular, but real. His voice stayed quiet. "That's compressor instability." Helena let out a short laugh. "You're diagnosing a jet engine by ear?" Marcus met her eyes. Yes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the aircraft trembled again. A sharper jolt this time. Several passengers gasped. Some looked around, suddenly alert. From the cabin ceiling came the faint creak of stressed metal adjusting to airflow changes. Helena's smile faltered slightly. She glanced toward the cockpit door. Marcus noticed. "You might want to tell them now," he said. Her jaw tightened. "Sir, the cockpit is busy flying the aircraft, and if that engine surges harder during climb, they won't be busy flying it anymore." The words were calm, matter-of-fact, but something in the way he said them made the air feel colder. A younger flight attendant standing behind Helena looked uncertain. "Helena, maybe we should just ask?" Helena shot her a look. "We are not relaying engine advice from passengers." Marcus didn't argue. He simply turned slightly, looking back down the aisle. Leela was watching him from row 27, her small face tense. He lifted his hand again. 2 fingers raised. The quiet signal he had used since she was little. "I'm here." She nodded slowly. The plane shuddered again, harder. This time several cups clinked loudly inside the galley cabinets. The younger attendant's eyes widened. Helena's confidence cracked just a little. But stubborn authority still held. "You need to sit down now," she said, stepping closer. Marcus didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, listening again. The oscillation was increasing, each surge coming closer together. His mind moved automatically through memory. High-altitude compressor stalls, surge cycles, engine imbalance during climb power. He had spent thousands of hours inside aircraft cockpits diagnosing exactly these kinds of sounds. Sounds that meant the line between safe flight and catastrophe was getting thinner. Helena reached for the interphone mounted beside the galley, not to call the cockpit, to call another attendant. Marcus watched her. "You don't have much time," he said quietly. That was when it happened. The engine outside let out a sudden deep thump. The entire aircraft lurched sideways, passengers cried out, overhead bins rattled violently. The plane corrected itself quickly, but the cabin erupted in nervous chatter. The younger attendant grabbed the counter. What was that? Alina's eyes were wide now. The confidence was gone. Marcus stepped closer to the interphone. "Now you call the cockpit." She hesitated only 1 second. Then she picked up the handset. "Captain, we're getting reports from the cabin of unusual vibration." Marcus listened carefully to the faint reply crackling through the speaker. The captain's voice sounded calm, professional. But Marcus recognized the tone. It was the voice pilots use when they suspect something is wrong but haven't confirmed it yet. Elena nodded slowly as she listened. Then she hung up. "They're aware," she said. Marcus didn't relax. "What did they say?" Her pride flared again. They didn't ask for passenger input. Marcus stared at her for a long moment. Then he spoke softly. Alina's jaw tightened. "Engines don't just stall," she said. Marcus met her gaze. "They do when the compressor can't maintain pressure." Before she could respond, the aircraft shuddered again, harder. The sound this time was sharper, a muffled bang from somewhere near the wing. Several passengers gasped. Someone near the back cursed under their breath. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. There it was. The surge had just partially broken through. He opened them again. "They need to throttle back," he said. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. "You can't know that." Marcus didn't argue. Instead, he slowly reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Elena stiffened immediately. "Sir?" But he simply pulled out a small worn leather card holder. Inside it sat a faded identification badge, not flashy. Not impressive at first glance, just an old credential with a photograph and a strip of metallic lettering. He placed it gently on the galley counter. Elena glanced down, then looked closer. Her expression shifted slightly. "What is this?" she asked. Marcus didn't answer directly. "You asked why I can hear the engine," he said. The younger attendant leaned forward to read the badge. Her eyebrows shot upward. "Wait." Elena picked it up now. The badge read, United States Air Force, Flight Test Division. Beneath the faded emblem was a name, Marcus Hale, and beneath that, a call sign. The letters were slightly worn from years of use, but still readable. Elena stared at it. "You were military?" Marcus gave a small shrug. "Used to be." The younger attendant looked between them. "What does flight test mean?" Marcus answered quietly. "It means I spent 15 years flying aircraft while engineers intentionally broke them." The words hung in the air. The vibration pulsed again beneath the floor. Another surge cycle. Marcus continued calmly. "My job was to hear problems before the instruments did." Elena looked from the badge back to his face. Her confidence was fading quickly now. "You expect me to believe." She read the worn letters from the badge, and the moment those words reached the cockpit, the captain stopped speaking. Silence crackled over the interphone. Elena blinked. "Captain?" The reply came back immediately, but the tone had completely changed, sharp, alert. "Put him on the line." For the first time since boarding, Elena Cruz looked at Marcus Hale with something close to disbelief, because the quiet single father she had mocked 20 minutes earlier had just made the cockpit go silent. For a moment, Elena Cruz simply stared at Marcus, the interphone still pressed to her ear. The captain's voice crackled again through the speaker, sharper this time. "Cabin crew, did you hear me? Put him on the line." The words carried just enough through the handset for Marcus to hear them clearly. Elena lowered the phone slowly. Her earlier confidence was gone now. replaced by a careful uncertainty she couldn't quite hide. The badge still rested in her other hand, the worn call sign staring up at her like a piece of evidence she hadn't expected to find. "You know the captain?" she asked quietly. Marcus shook his head. Probably not. The aircraft vibrated again beneath their feet, the oscillation pulsing through the floor panels. Another compressor surge cycle. He could hear the engine trying to stabilize itself. It was failing. Elena swallowed. The younger attendant beside her whispered, "Elena, just give him the phone." Passengers nearby had fallen silent now, watching openly. Marcus noticed Leela again down the aisle, her small face turned toward him, worry creeping into her eyes. He lifted his hand slightly. 2 fingers raised. "I'm here," she nodded faintly, clutching the rabbit. Elena hesitated only 1 more second. Then she extended the interphone. "Captain wants to speak with you." Marcus took it. His voice stayed calm. "This is Marcus Hale," a beat of silence. Then the captain's voice came through. Different now. Focused. "Hale." "Confirm call sign," Marcus said it quietly. On the other end of the line there was a brief inhale. Then the captain spoke again. "I thought you retired." "Years ago," Marcus replied. Another vibration pulsed through the aircraft. Marcus leaned slightly against the galley wall to steady himself. "Captain, you're getting compressor instability on engine 2. The cockpit went silent again for a moment. Then the captain answered. "We're seeing fluctuating pressure ratios, yes." Marcus nodded even though the pilot couldn't see him. "You're in a surge cycle." A pause. "That's what it looks like." Marcus closed his eyes briefly, listening to the rhythm of the engine. The pulses were getting closer together. "Reduce climb power now," he said calmly, "before the compressor stalls completely." In the cockpit, the captain muttered something to his first officer. Marcus heard switches clicking faintly over the open line. Then the captain spoke again. Throttle reduction coming. Marcus listened carefully. The vibration softened slightly. But it didn't disappear. "Not enough," Marcus said. "The surge pattern's still there." Elena watched his face closely now, every trace of earlier arrogance gone. Passengers nearby leaned forward. Even those farther back had noticed something serious was happening. The younger attendant whispered, "Is the plane okay?" Marcus raised 1 finger to signal silence. He listened again. Another deep pulse moved through the engine. He spoke quickly. "Captain, the airflow's collapsing inside the compressor stages. If the surge builds again, you'll get a full stall." The captain's voice returned. "What's your recommendation?" Marcus opened his eyes. "Level the climb. Reduce thrust further. Let the engine stabilize before it eats itself." The cockpit fell quiet again as the crew processed the advice. Moments later, the aircraft's nose angle shifted slightly. The climb eased. Passengers probably assumed it was normal flight adjustment. Not because Marcus looked important, but because of the badge Elena still held in her hand. "You Hale?" the pilot asked. Marcus nodded once. The first officer opened the door wider. "Captain says come up." The cabin fell silent. Passengers nearby watched with open curiosity now. A few people craned their necks, trying to understand why the quiet man from economy was suddenly being invited into the cockpit. Elena stepped aside automatically. The authority she had carried earlier seemed to drain from her posture. Marcus handed the interphone back and moved toward the cockpit. Then he paused. He turned slightly and looked down the aisle again. Leela. Her feet swung nervously beneath the seat in front of her, but the moment she saw him looking, she straightened and raised the rabbit. A silent signal. "I'm okay." Marcus gave her the 2-finger signal again. "I'm here." Then he ducked into the cockpit. The door closed behind him with a heavy mechanical lock. Inside, the cockpit smelled faintly of electronics and warm metal. The captain sat in the left seat, eyes flicking between engine readouts and the horizon beyond the windshield. The first officer slid back into his seat on the right. The captain turned his head. Marcus Hale. Not a question. Marcus nodded. "You flying commercial now?" the captain asked. Marcus shook his head. "Just traveling." The aircraft vibrated lightly beneath their feet. The captain gestured toward the engine display. "You heard that surge from the cabin?" Marcus stepped closer. The instrument panel glowed with rows of digital readings, engine pressure ratios, turbine temperature, fuel flow. Engine 2's readings were still fluctuating slightly. "Yeah," Marcus said quietly. He leaned closer to the display. Compressor instability started during climb. The captain nodded. "That's what we're seeing." Marcus studied the numbers for several seconds. The vibration trembled through the cockpit floor again, not as strong as before, but still there. "How long have you been at reduced thrust?" Marcus asked. 2 minutes. Marcus listened carefully to the engine sound through the airframe. The surge rhythm had changed again. That wasn't good. He looked up. "Captain, that compressor stage is still struggling." The first officer glanced at the instruments. "Pressure ratios look better." Marcus nodded slightly. "They do." Another vibration pulse. Subtle, but unmistakable. "Problem is," Marcus continued calmly, "the surge cycle's still trying to restart." The captain leaned back slightly. "You think we're heading for a full stall?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes again for 2 seconds, listening, feeling. Another faint tremor passed through the aircraft. He opened his eyes. "If it surges harder during climb, yeah." The cockpit went quiet. Outside the windshield, the aircraft was cruising above a sea of clouds, sunlight pouring across the wings. Everything looked peaceful. But inside the engine, airflow was fighting itself. The captain rubbed his jaw. "What would you do?" Marcus studied the instruments again. Then he looked at the engine thrust lever. "Idle it." The first officer blinked. "You're suggesting we shut down engine 2? Marcus shook his head slightly. "Not shut down. Idle." He tapped the pressure ratio display. "Let the compressor airflow stabilize before the surge builds again." The captain considered it. "We can't climb on one engine. You won't need to," Marcus said calmly. "You level out first." The first officer leaned forward. "If the compressor stage is damaged," Marcus nodded. "Then, pushing climb power will make it worse." The captain looked at him carefully now. "You've dealt with this before." Marcus gave a faint half-smile. "More times than I'd like." Outside, the aircraft vibrated again. A deeper pulse this time. All 3 men heard it. The captain didn't hesitate. Engine 2, idle. The first officer pulled the thrust lever back. The engine pitch dropped. Inside the airframe, the vibration softened almost immediately. Marcus listened closely. 3 seconds. 5. 10. The surge cycle faded. The compressor airflow stabilized. Marcus exhaled slowly. That should halt. The captain watched the engine display. Numbers steadied. Pressure ratios normalized. Turbine temperatures cooled slightly. The first officer looked over. "Well, I'll be damned." Marcus leaned back slightly from the console. "You caught it early." The captain looked at him. "No," he said. "We didn't." He nodded toward the cabin behind them. "You did." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then the captain reached over and keyed the cabin intercom. "Flight attendants, cockpit." Alina's voice came back almost instantly. "Yes, Captain?" The pilot glanced at Marcus once more before answering. "The passenger you sent up." He paused, then said calmly, "Just prevented a compressor stall at 30,000 feet." Outside the cockpit door, the cabin crew listened in stunned silence. And down in row 27, Lila Hale sat very still. Because even without hearing the words, she knew something important had just happened. Outside the cockpit, Elena Cruz still held the interphone against her ear, just prevented a compressor stall at 30,000 feet. The captain's words hung in the small space of the forward galley like something heavy and fragile at the same time. For a moment, Elena didn't answer. She simply stared at the closed cockpit door. The younger attendant beside her blinked twice. Did he just say, prevented? Elena slowly lowered the handset. Yes. Her voice sounded quieter than it had all day. Around them, several nearby passengers had noticed the sudden stillness among the crew. The man in seat 3C leaned toward the aisle, trying to overhear. A woman across from him whispered something to her husband. Down the aisle, Leela sat clutching her rabbit, watching the front of the cabin with wide eyes. Elena realized something else then. Every person who had witnessed her earlier confrontation with Marcus was still here, still watching, still remembering. The younger attendant spoke carefully. Should we tell them what's happening? Elena shook her head slightly, not yet. But inside her chest, the memory of her own words replayed again and again. Passengers don't diagnose jet engines. She exhaled slowly. Then, the cockpit door unlocked again. Marcus stepped out. The cabin went quiet immediately. Not completely silent, airplanes never were, but the kind of hush that spreads when everyone senses something serious has just happened. Marcus paused in the doorway as the first officer closed it behind him. He looked exactly the same as before. Same worn jacket, same tired eyes, same father who had been standing in the aisle earlier holding a boarding pass. Only now Elena looked at him differently, not as a passenger, but as someone who clearly understood the aircraft better than anyone in the cabin. She stepped toward him slowly. "Captain says the engine is stable," she said. Marcus nodded. For now, the younger attendant asked nervously, "Are we safe?" Marcus thought about the question carefully. "Safer," he said. That answer didn't calm her completely. But it was honest. He turned slightly, looking down the aisle again. Leela was still watching him. He raised 2 fingers. She smiled faintly. Marcus started walking back toward his seat. But Elena spoke again. "Mr. Hale," he stopped. Not annoyed, just patient. She hesitated before continuing. "I misjudged the situation earlier." Marcus studied her for a moment. The passengers nearby leaned subtly closer to hear. She forced the words out. "And I misjudged you." Marcus didn't answer immediately. The airplane hummed steadily around them, the engine noise smoother now that the surge had faded. Finally, he shrugged lightly. Most people do. He continued down the aisle. As he passed row 27, Leela twisted around immediately. "Daddy," Marcus crouched beside her seat. "You okay?" She nodded quickly. "Did you fix the plane?" Marcus smiled a little. "Helped a bit." Her eyes widened. "I knew you would." Across the aisle, the middle-aged woman who had spoken to him earlier shook her head in disbelief. "You weren't kidding about listening to the engines." Marcus sat down in seat 30C again. "Guess not." Up front, Elena stood still for several seconds. Passengers were whispering now. Some had heard pieces of the conversation with the cockpit. Others had simply seen the change in the crew's behavior. The businessman from earlier leaned into the aisle again. "What's going on up there?" he asked loudly. Elena straightened her uniform automatically. Professional control returned to her posture. But it felt different now. Less rigid, more careful. She picked up the intercom microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "the captain would like to thank everyone for their patience. We experienced a minor engine fluctuation during climb, but the situation has been stabilized." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Someone asked, was it dangerous? Alina hesitated. Her eyes drifted briefly down the aisle to Marcus. He sat quietly, one arm resting along the seat back, watching Leela talk animatedly to the woman across from her. The tired single dad she had dismissed earlier. The man who had just prevented a compressor stall at 30,000 feet. She lifted the microphone again. The situation was resolved thanks to additional expertise on board. Passengers exchanged confused glances. Alina lowered the microphone slowly. Then she did something she hadn't expected to do when this flight began. She walked down the aisle, all the way to row 30. Marcus looked up when she stopped beside him. Her voice was calm now. Captain would like you to remain available in case the engine becomes unstable again. Marcus nodded. Of course, she added quietly. And thank you. Marcus gave a small shrug. My daughter's on this plane. Elena glanced toward Leela again. The little girl waved at her shyly. For the first time that day, Elena Cruz smiled back. Then she turned and walked toward the galley. Behind her, the passengers of Flight 417 were beginning to realize something remarkable had just happened. The man they had seen mocked earlier was the only person on board who had heard the danger coming. And the flight wasn't over yet, because Marcus was still listening to the engine. Marcus settled deeper into seat 30C, but he didn't relax. Not really. Most of the cabin had started returning to normal behavior. A few passengers reopened laptops. Others resumed quiet conversations. The tension that had rippled through the aircraft was fading into the background hum of flight. But Marcus still listened. The engine tone outside had stabilized after the captain pulled the thrust back to idle, yet the sound still carried a faint irregularity. It wasn't dangerous now, but it wasn't perfect either. Machines rarely failed all at once. They warned you first. He tilted his head slightly against the seat back, letting the vibration of the aircraft speak through the metal frame beneath him. Across the aisle, the middle-aged woman studied him with open curiosity. You didn't seem surprised by any of that, she said. Marcus shrugged. Engines talk. She laughed softly. Most people just hear noise. Most people haven't spent years inside them, he replied. 3 rows ahead, Lila turned around again. Daddy, are we really okay now? Marcus leaned forward slightly so she could see his face. We're okay. She studied him carefully. Children always knew when adults were hiding something. Mostly okay? She asked. He smiled a little. Mostly, that seemed to satisfy her. She turned back in her seat and began whispering excitedly to the woman beside her about how her dad helps airplanes. Marcus watched her for a moment, his expression softening. Then he listened again. The surge cycle hadn't returned. Good. But the compressor stage still sounded uneven under load. That meant one of two things. Either the airflow disturbance had temporarily stabilized, or a blade inside the compressor had already been damaged. If it was the second, the engine might behave for hours. Or it might surge again without warning. Marcus exhaled quietly. From the front of the cabin, Elena Cruz stepped into the aisle again. Her posture had regained its professional composure, but her movements were more deliberate now, less performative. She approached row 30 again. Captain asked me to check on you, she said quietly. Marcus nodded. I'm still listening. She leaned slightly closer. Is the engine still unstable? Marcus answered honestly. It's behaving. That didn't sound reassuring. She folded her arms lightly. And if it stops behaving? Marcus looked toward the wing again. Then the cockpit will need to shut it down completely. Elena inhaled slowly. And we can still fly? Yes, on one engine. Yes, her eyes widened just a fraction. You sound very calm about that. Marcus gave a small half-smile. Airplanes are designed for it. She studied him for a moment longer. I looked up your call sign. Marcus raised an eyebrow. That didn't take long. The captain asked operations to confirm it. And? Alina hesitated. They seemed surprised. Marcus chuckled softly. That's one way to put it. She lowered her voice further. They said you were one of the Air Force test pilots who specialized in compressor surge testing. Marcus looked away toward the window. That was a long time ago. Alina shook her head slowly. You used to intentionally fly aircraft until the engines failed. Until we understood why they failed, Marcus corrected. She glanced toward Lila again. And now you're sitting in economy with your daughter. Marcus followed her gaze. Life changes. Elena seemed about to ask something else. Then the aircraft vibrated again, just slightly. Marcus's head turned instantly. The sound wasn't as violent as before. But it was there, a small tremor in the engine rhythm. Elena noticed the change in his expression. Did you hear something? Marcus nodded slowly, small airflow disruption. Her shoulders stiffened. Is it happening again? Marcus listened carefully. 3 seconds passed. 5. The vibration faded. He relaxed slightly. No, then what was it? Marcus leaned back. The compressor adjusting. That sounds bad. It's normal after a surge event. Alina didn't look convinced. Before she could respond, the intercom above them chimed. The captain's voice filled the cabin again. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. As mentioned earlier, we experienced a minor engine instability during climb. Out of an abundance of caution, we'll be maintaining a slightly lower cruising altitude while we monitor the situation. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The captain continued. There's no immediate danger, and we appreciate your patience. The announcement ended. Elena exhaled. Lower altitude, she murmured. Marcus nodded. Smart move. She looked at him again. You really saved this plane, didn't you? Marcus shook his head gently. I heard a warning. And acted on it. Anyone trained to listen would have. But both of them knew that wasn't true. Because no one else on the aircraft had heard it. Alina straightened slowly. I owe you an apology. Marcus met her eyes. You already said that. I meant it. He nodded once. Then the aircraft vibrated again. Stronger this time. Not violent. But unmistakable. Marcus's expression changed instantly. His head tilted. Listening. The surge pattern was returning. Slowly. And the engine outside the window whispered the same dangerous rhythm it had before. Marcus leaned forward in his seat. Because the problem wasn't finished yet. Marcus didn't wait for the vibration to repeat. He was already on his feet. Elena saw the movement instantly. What is it? She asked. Marcus tilted his head again, focusing on the engine tone vibrating through the fuselage. There, he said quietly. The pulse came again. A faint shudder rolled beneath the floor panels, traveling through the cabin structure like a ripple through steel. Passengers nearby noticed it this time. What was that? Someone whispered. Marcus didn't answer them. He looked at Elena. The surge cycle is coming back. Her face went pale. But the captain reduced thrust. It's not enough anymore. Another pulse hit. Stronger. The overhead bins rattled briefly. Marcus moved toward the front of the aircraft without hesitation. Elena, I need the cockpit again. This time she didn't argue. She stepped aside immediately and grabbed the interphone. Captain, Marcus Hale says the surge is returning. The response came instantly. Send him in. The cockpit door unlocked again. Marcus stepped inside quickly. The captain looked up the moment he entered. You hear it again? Marcus nodded. It's rebuilding. The first officer checked the instruments. Pressure ratios are fluctuating again. Marcus leaned toward the display. The numbers confirmed what his ears had already told him. Engine 2's compressor airflow was collapsing again under load. "You're about to get another surge," Marcus said calmly. The aircraft shuddered again. This time the sound came with a dull bang from the wing. The first officer swore under his breath, "That's the second stall." Marcus pointed at the thrust lever. "Idle it further. It's already near idle," the captain replied. Marcus listened again. The engine pitch sounded strained now, unstable. "You have compressor blade damage," Marcus said quietly. The cockpit went silent. The captain's jaw tightened. If that's true, Marcus finished the thought, the surge cycles won't stop. The first officer looked at the engine display again. "Pressure ratios are dropping." Marcus nodded. "That blade is disrupting airflow across the compressor stages." Another violent shudder rocked the aircraft. Passengers in the cabin cried out. The captain made the decision instantly. Engine 2 shut down. The first officer reached forward and pulled the fuel cutoff switch. The engine outside spooled down rapidly. The roar faded. Inside the aircraft, the vibration disappeared almost immediately. The sudden quiet from that side of the plane felt strange, but stable. Marcus exhaled slowly. "That'll stop the surges." The captain kept his eyes on the instruments. "Confirm engine 2 shutdown." The first officer nodded. Confirmed, the aircraft now cruised on its remaining engine. Marcus leaned back slightly from the panel. "Now it's just a long glide to Lisbon." The captain looked at him. "One engine is enough?" Marcus smiled faintly. "Commercial jets are built to fly on one all day." The first officer chuckled nervously. "Let's hope we don't have to test that." The captain keyed the cabin intercom. "Flight attendants, cockpit." Helena answered immediately. "Yes, Captain? We've shut down engine 2 as a precaution. Aircraft is stable and operating normally." In the cabin, a wave of whispers spread instantly. Helena glanced toward the wing through the nearest window. Only one engine was spinning now. Her stomach tightened. She spoke again. "Passengers will notice?" "Yes," the captain replied. "Make an announcement." Helena swallowed. "Yes, Captain." Inside the cockpit, Marcus listened carefully to the remaining engine. Smooth. Stable. Exactly what they needed. The captain looked over. "You staying up here?" Marcus shook his head. "My daughter's waiting." The captain nodded respectfully. "Marcus, thank you." Marcus shrugged lightly. Just listening, he stepped out of the cockpit. The door locked behind him again. In the cabin, dozens of passengers were now watching the front galley. Some had clearly heard the captain's words through the thin cockpit door. Others had noticed the change in engine sound. Marcus walked calmly back down the aisle. People moved their legs aside automatically as he passed. The businessman from earlier stared at him with wide eyes. "Are we flying on one engine?" Marcus paused briefly. "Yeah." The man looked horrified. Marcus added calmly, "It's safer than two unstable ones." That didn't completely comfort him. When Marcus reached row 27, Leela twisted around immediately. "Daddy." He crouched beside her seat. "We're okay," he said. She searched his face. "Promise?" Marcus nodded. "Promise." Across the aisle, the middle-aged woman shook her head slowly. "I can't believe that just happened." Marcus sat back down in seat 30C. The aircraft hummed steadily as it cruised across the Atlantic sky. One engine silent. One engine carrying the entire plane. Up front, Alina picked up the intercom microphone. Her voice carried through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've shut down one engine as a precaution." Passengers held their breath. She continued carefully, "But the aircraft is completely stable." Then she looked down the aisle. Right at Marcus Hale. "And we have someone extraordinary on board, making sure it stays that way." Passengers turned to look. And for the first time since boarding, no one saw a tired single father in a worn jacket. They saw the man who had saved their flight. For a moment after Elena's announcement, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Dozens of passengers slowly turned in their seats, their eyes following her gaze down the aisle. And all of them landed on Marcus. He sat in row 30C, one arm resting loosely along the seat back, the other holding the edge of the armrest near Lila's row. The same worn jacket, the same quiet posture. Nothing about him looked extraordinary. Except now everyone knew something they hadn't before. A murmur spread through the cabin. That's him? The passenger? The one who warned the cockpit? The businessman in 3C leaned farther into the aisle, studying Marcus like he was seeing him for the first time. Elena remained at the front for a moment longer, letting the tension settle before setting the microphone back into its cradle. Then she walked down the aisle again. Not with the sharp, commanding stride she had used earlier. This time it was slower, deliberate, respectful. Passengers parted slightly as she passed them. When she reached row 30, she stopped beside Marcus again. Every nearby passenger leaned subtly closer. Even those pretending not to listen were clearly paying attention. Elena looked down at him. "Captain asked me to pass along something else." Marcus glanced up. "What's that?" She hesitated, then said clearly enough for several rows to hear. "He said you probably saved this aircraft." The cabin fell silent again. Marcus shook his head lightly. "I warned him about the surge and the engine shutdown?" she asked. That was his call. Elena studied him carefully. Most people would be taking credit right now, Marcus shrugged. Most people don't have a daughter watching them. Leela grinned proudly from 3 rows ahead. The middle-aged woman across from Marcus laughed softly. "That's the calmest hero I've ever seen." Marcus shifted slightly in his seat. "I'm not a hero." But the passengers around him clearly disagreed. A man behind him leaned forward. "You heard that engine from economy?" Marcus nodded. "Yeah. How?" Marcus gave the same answer he had earlier. "Engines talk." The man shook his head in amazement. Elena glanced toward the cockpit door again. "Captain said something else too." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" She looked down at the worn badge still sitting on the galley counter behind her. "He said your call sign hasn't been used in the system for years." Marcus smiled faintly. "That's because I stopped flying." "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted to Leela again. The little girl was now happily explaining to her seatmate how her dad helps planes when they get confused. Marcus chuckled softly. "My wife passed away," he said quietly. Elena's expression softened immediately. "I'm sorry." Marcus nodded. "After that, I decided I wanted to be a full-time dad instead of a test pilot." The cabin had grown very quiet again. Because suddenly the story made sense. The tired clothes, the cheap luggage, the patience earlier when Elena had mocked him. He hadn't been weak. He had simply been a father trying to get his daughter across an ocean. Elena inhaled slowly. "I owe you a much bigger apology than the one I gave earlier." Marcus met her eyes calmly. "You already admitted you misjudged me." "Yes." "And?" She hesitated. "I also embarrassed you in front of your daughter." Marcus glanced toward Leela again. The girl was giggling now, completely unaware of the emotional weight in the conversation behind her. He looked back at Elena. She learned something today. Elena looked uneasy. "What's that?" Marcus smiled slightly. "That sometimes the people who underestimate you just haven't heard you yet." For the first time since boarding, Elena Cruz laughed. Not a professional laugh, a real one. "You're a better person than I expected." Marcus tilted his head. "That happens a lot too." The businessman in 3C suddenly stood and began clapping. It started awkwardly. just one pair of hands. Then another passenger joined. Then another. Within seconds, the entire front half of the cabin was applauding. Some passengers even stood in the aisle. Marcus looked stunned. He lifted a hand awkwardly. That's not necessary. But the applause continued. Lila twisted around again, eyes wide. "Daddy, why are they clapping?" Marcus rubbed the back of his neck. "Because people like airplanes that stay in the sky," she nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good reason." The applause slowly faded. Passengers settled back into their seats, many still smiling or shaking their heads in disbelief. Alina remained beside Marcus for a moment longer. Then she said quietly, "I won't forget this flight." Marcus nodded. "Neither will the captain." She smiled again. "And neither will I." Then she walked back toward the galley. As she passed through the cabin, the passengers of Flight 417 looked at her differently too, because earlier that day she had been the authority, the one in charge, the one deciding who mattered. But now everyone understood something much clearer. The quiet single dad she had mocked was the only reason they were still flying safely over the Atlantic, and back in seat 30C. Marcus Hale simply leaned his head back, listening to the remaining engine hum steadily through the airframe. Because even now, he was still listening. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft continued its long, steady path across the Atlantic. With engine 2 shut down, the sound inside the plane had changed. The deep roar passengers usually heard from both wings had softened into a steadier hum from the remaining engine. To most people, it simply sounded quieter. To Marcus, it sounded balanced. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to listen. The vibration traveling through the fuselage was smooth now, predictable. The kind of rhythm that told him the aircraft was finally behaving the way it should. 3 rows ahead, Leela had fallen asleep with the rabbit tucked under her chin. Marcus watched her for a moment. That alone made everything worth it. Across the aisle, the middle-aged woman who had spoken with him earlier smiled. "She trusts you completely," she said softly. Marcus nodded. "I try to earn that every day." Up front, Elena Cruz stood near the galley, speaking quietly with the other attendants. Every so often her eyes drifted down the aisle toward row 30 again, not out of suspicion anymore, out of respect. Eventually, she walked back toward him once more. "Captain asked me to let you know we'll begin descent in about 40 minutes, she said. Marcus nodded. "Engine still stable?" "Yes," she replied, "completely." He listened again for a moment. The airflow through the fuselage sounded calm, no irregular pulses, no dangerous rhythms hiding beneath the noise. "Good," he said. Alina hesitated before speaking again. "You know, earlier today I thought I understood this job completely." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And now?" She glanced toward the wing outside. "Now I realize how much we don't see." Marcus smiled faintly. "Airplanes are like that." "I meant people," she said. He didn't answer. But he understood exactly what she meant. A few minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be beginning our descent into Lisbon shortly." Passengers shifted in their seats, the quiet buzz of movement returning to the cabin. The captain continued, "And before we land, I'd like to recognize someone on board today." Marcus sighed quietly. "Oh no," he murmured. Across the aisle, the woman laughed. "You're not escaping this one." The captain's voice carried warmly through the cabin. "Earlier in the flight, we experienced a compressor surge that forced us to shut down Engine 2. Thanks to the quick ears and expertise of a passenger traveling with us today, we were able to identify the problem before it became dangerous." Passengers began turning in their seats again. The captain finished. "Marcus Hale, if you're listening, The crew and everyone on this aircraft owe you our thanks." Applause erupted again. This time it filled the entire plane. Marcus rubbed his face with one hand, embarrassed. Lila woke up to the sound and blinked sleepily. "Daddy? Yeah? Why are they clapping again?" Marcus smiled. Because we're almost there, she seemed satisfied with that answer. The plane slowly began descending through layers of soft white cloud. Outside the window, sunlight reflected off the Atlantic below. Inside the cabin, the mood had completely changed from the tension of earlier hours. Passengers talked more easily. Crew members moved through the aisle with relaxed smiles, and every now and then someone glanced toward the quiet man in row 30. Not because of what he wore, but because of what he had done. Marcus watched the clouds pass beneath the wing. Years ago, he had flown experimental jets at the edge of their limits, intentionally pushing machines until engineers could learn how they failed. Now he spent most of his days packing school lunches and helping with homework, and honestly, he preferred it. The aircraft broke through the final cloud layer. Lisbon's coastline appeared ahead. The runways stretched toward them like a narrow ribbon between the sea and the city. Marcus felt the landing gear extend beneath the plane. Another familiar vibration. Normal, healthy, exactly the way it should sound. He looked at Leela. Ready to land? She grinned. Always. The plane touched down smoothly moments later. Applause filled the cabin again as the remaining engine roared briefly during reverse thrust. When the aircraft finally rolled to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. Many of them stopped by row 30 before leaving. Some shook Marcus's hand. Others simply nodded respectfully. The businessman from earlier paused awkwardly. "Guess I shouldn't judge people by jackets," he admitted. Marcus smiled. "That's a good place to start." Soon the cabin emptied. Marcus lifted Leela's backpack onto his shoulder and took her hand. As they stepped into the jet bridge, Alina stood waiting beside the door. She met his eyes. "Safe travels, Mr. Hale." Marcus nodded. "You too." Then he and Leela walked into the terminal together. Just another father and daughter continuing their journey. But every person on Flight 415 would remember the moment a quiet single dad they had underestimated turned out to be the one person who could hear the danger before anyone else. And if you want another powerful story like this, ask me for the next title. Subscribe, and don't miss our next story, The Janitor They Fired Fixed the Reactor and Exposed the CEO Who Broke It. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?